Welcome to Festival Hall, and this is the third of our series of lectures. This one featuring Dr. Bud Robertson. He's a historian of the Civil War period, and he's really the leading authority of the Civil War. He's written a number of books, and there's a few books on sale in the back that he's willing to sign after the lecture. And anyway, he's also served as executive director on the Centennial Commission and worked with Presidents Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson in marking the war's 100th anniversary. Well, now this is the Sesquicentennial anniversary of the Appomattox, so that's going to be the major discussion this evening. Without too much further ado, I would like to turn the podium over to our guest speaker, Dr. Robertson. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty, and good evening to you all. Thank you for coming out on Monday evening. And if Miss Mountjoy invites me again, I'm going to ask that she pick another night. I love seafood, and I've been wanting very badly to eat at that restaurant down at the tip of town, but it's closed on Mondays. And this is the second Monday I've gotten blindsided on that. And Subway is not a good substitute for seafood. And there's a fascination to being here in Reedville for me personally. You all live at the eastern end of US 360. I was born and raised at the western end of US 360 in Danville. In fact, I can show you the precise point where this US highway begins. So I kind of feel a kinship here with US 360 being the umbilical cord, if you will. Tonight's going to be a little different because I'm not going to talk to you so much about history per se as I am what we do with history. And that's called basically historiography. And I'm going to concentrate on that because the great majority of you are Virginians by birth, some of you are by adoption, and we take that kind as well. And I want to talk to you in large part about what your state's Civil War Sesquicentennial has done, of which most of you are unaware because we don't beat our own drum, as is so often the temptation with a commission like this. Well, I'm very, very busy, to say the least. We go back home tonight, and then Wednesday morning I go to Appomattox, where in the next 3 days I speak 4 times and to commemorate the end of the war with General Lee surrendering to Grant. And that will basically almost conclude the Civil War Sesquicentennial, which began in this state in 2008 and has been going on now for 7 years. And I'll talk about that, what Virginia has done momentarily. The 150th anniversary of the Civil War Sesquicentennial, and you have to say it a while to get used to it, has not been as spectacular as was the centennial commemoration back in the 1960s. Keen disappointment exists in many circles at what has not been done. Yet the Sesquicentennial, I would suggest, was doomed from the start. You see, America today is a far cry in spirit and in attitude and in love of country from the America of 50 years ago. A national apathy for history lays over our land. Steven Spielberg's movie, Lincoln, was the only commercial success of the Sesquicentennial. Back in the centennial, there were just a bevy of movies, including my favorite Civil War movie, Shenandoah, with James Stewart. Ron Maxwell's equally touching film, Copperhead, which came out 2 years ago, never gained the attention that it so richly deserved. It's a beautiful movie. And sometime if you're going out to rent or buy a DVD, buy Copperhead. It's just a great Civil War movie. No action, no Civil War battles, but it's set in a Civil War scenario. Little demand during the Sesquicentennial existed for books. There weren't a multitude of trinkets or memorabilia sold. There were little reminders of the Sesquicentennial, and in this state, the chief reminder was the official logo of the state's participation in the Sesquicentennial. Indeed, at some reenactments, the soldiers outnumbered the number who came to watch what the soldiers were going to do. There was no nationwide appeal, and in some political circles you might say, thank God for that. Indeed, outside the always tireless efforts of the National Park Service, I know of nothing extraordinary that the federal government did to even acknowledge the 150th anniversary. In 2006, a bill was introduced in Congress to create a National Sesquicentennial Commission, just as we had in the 60s with the Centennial Commission. 9 years later, that bill lies in the dead file of some subcommittee in Congress. Public appeals for a commemoration fell on deaf ears in Washington in general and the White House in particular. The present administration displayed an incredible indifference to Civil War history. As for the totally dysfunctional Congress, it is so hog-tied by partisan politics and general negativism that it cannot handle the needs of the present, much less look back at the past with any sense of understanding. Other factors worked against the Sesquicentennial years. Some states used, quote, quote, economic constraints to avoid learning from past mistakes. Yet being able to learn from history is one of the most valuable gifts we human beings have. And so-called happy history, that is, we report only the beauty spots, we overlook the warts, is nothing more than political correctness in reverse. A number of southern states feared repercussions if they attempted to reflect on the Civil War. Public uneasiness over divisive racial issues loomed as targets. Even worse, and continues to be, a general failure in public education to show how the Civil War was the defining moment for the Union we all love. Then there are those who see no value in looking back, and to them goes our deepest pity. Among the first commandments a professionally trained historian learns is a simple one. Any nation that forgets its past has no future. History is absolutely contingent and consistent on that point. Any nation that fails to look back will have nowhere to go. Now, I painted a gloomy picture, but there was one exception, a standout exception, an extraordinary exception to all of that. And that was one state, the only state, that recognized an inherent obligation attendant to the Sesquicentennial. And that state was your state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. It is the mother state of America. It became the Southern Confederacy's most vital member. Virginia contributed such figures in the war as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, J.F. Stewart, A.P. Hill, as well as Union Generals Winfield Scott and George Thomas. How ironic it is that the state where America began was the state most destroyed by the war. Virginia suffered more destruction in 4 years than any area in the Western Hemisphere. Over 60% of the battles of the war were fought within our borders. In 1884, an English visitor noted, "It is difficult to depict and impossible to exaggerate the sufferings which Virginia has undergone." And a newspaper correspondent visiting in Fredericksburg in the last autumn of the war remarked that he saw, quote, "not a fence, not an inhabited house in sight. All," he said, "is still as death for miles and miles." And by 1865, what had not been devastated was crippled. Virginia was bankrupt, its governmental agencies non-existent, its constitutional powers suspended. The once blooming state was a vast wasteland with fields covered with shell holes and weeds, charred ashes and black chimneys marking where grand structures had once stood. Worse, the western third of Virginia's pre-war territory had been irretrievably lost, formed into a new state of still questionable legality. Half of Virginia's white men of military age had been killed or permanently wounded. And we are talking about a war. And I've tried so hard to make statistics come alive. Let me try this approach. We are talking about a war in which for 4 years, 500 men will die each day, which means at the end of this week, 3,500 will have died. 14,000 casualties would come with each passing month for 4 heartbreaking years. If measured by modern-day population and proportion, America would lose 7 million young men in that war. A civilized nation cannot forget such a loss of life. A civilized nation cannot forget. We owe something to each of those individuals who died that we might enjoy life. The Civil War can never be ignored. Therefore, the Old Dominion became the centerpiece of the 150th anniversary, and it had no rivals. To put it bluntly, the Sesquicentennial was Virginia. That's it, Virginia. More importantly, our state lived up to its historical traditions so successfully that the Sesquicentennial nationally will be remembered because of what the Commonwealth of Virginia did to honor the past. It was not that Virginians loved the nation less, but that they loved Virginia more. And the one individual most responsible for the creation of Virginia's Civil War sesquicentennial was Speaker of the House of Delegates, William Howe. He deserves the credit, but for Bill Howe there would have been no sesquicentennial commission. But Bill Howe is a Virginian through and through with a deep sense of history, and he just refused to let the 150th anniversary pass without a study of history. And so he joined with his senatorial compatriot, although they were of opposite parties, President Pro Tem Charles Colgan, who's senator from Manassas. You know him better. He was the father of Piedmont Airlines. And it was Bill and Charles together who formed the Virginia Civil War Centennial Commission, on which I had the honor to serve from beginning to end. And they were tireless in their energies to preserve the past, and they have become treasured friends. And I know you can't vote for Bill Howe and you can't vote against him, but I'm telling you, he is the most decent politician I've ever met, a man whose heart is truly in the state that he adores. The 16-member commission in 2009 initiated annual signature conferences, and there was symposia that met annually on various campuses around the state. Teams of scholars discussed the Civil War from various directions. The one we held at Virginia Tech treated the military aspects of the war. The one at Williamsburg concentrated on the social effects. George Mason's seminar was on diplomatic history, etc. And the proceedings of all of these meetings are preserved now. They were made available through DVDs and book forms, and you can order them from the commission itself in Richmond. Tourism is one of Virginia's principal sources of income. At least 25% of the tourists who come into the Old Dominion come here specifically to visit Civil War sites. And they spend an average of $505 a day in our state. And to think in Economics 101, the more attractions you give them, the longer they stay, the more money they spend, the better off you are. It runs in a very simple cycle. The Sesquicentennial generated a 90% increase in tourism in our state. Obviously, the more there was to see, the longer travelers stayed. And those visitors went home and became, in essence, goodwill ambassadors because they extolled the inspirational sites found in our state. As an example, and I doubt if many of you in this room know this, last year, thanks to Richmond's unique history and the Civil War sesquicentennial, the Virginia Capitol was classified in 2014 as the 14th best place to visit in the world. Richmond, Virginia, the 14th best place in the entire world to visit. Now that would have pleased the state's Centennial Commission back in the 1960s, because everything it did was Richmond-based. And however, when the 150th anniversary got underway, we decided to take a totally opposite approach. Richmond would simply be the reservoir, if you were, for help. It urged the 134 cities and counties in the state to focus on their own involvements in the war, with the commission standing by to give whatever aid it could in the compilation, production, publicity, and the like. Now, local history is the seed from which a nation's heritage blossoms, stressing home contributions, if nothing else, the makeup of the military units organized in the area proved both enlightening and educational. You down here in Northumberland County have two particular units of which you should be quite proud, the 9th Virginia Cavalry and the 40th Virginia Infantry, heavily Northern Neck in composition. And I'm sure there were many services held pertaining to these two units. The commission made small grant awards to local sesquicentennial committees to help them in various projects. And toward that end, small grant awards in the amount of $247,000 went out to the 100 plus local committees. And matching funds from local sponsors brought a total of $581,600 to local history and projects of a local content. And those projects range from refurbishing cemeteries and publishing pamphlets to school programs, local commemorations, and the like. And as Cheryl Jackson, the tireless director of the Sesquicentennial Commission, told me in a phone call on Friday, these local sesquicentennial committees over a 4-year period sponsored an unbelievable 1,300 events. It far eclipsed anything we did in the Civil War centennial a half century ago. To take the war further to the people, the State Commission developed an extremely beneficial project in cooperation with the Virginia Historical Society. And we call it, and many of you have seen it, the History Mobile. It is an expandable 53-foot trailer that has exhibits, mementos, and demonstrations about all classes involved in the war. The young and the old, the black and the white, the enslaved and the free, the soldiers and the civilians. The History Mobile has crisscrossed this state from Arlington to Danville and from Virginia Beach to Cumberland Gap. To date, the award-winning mobile exhibit has been visited by more than 140,000 people. And what is most pleasing to us is that over 40% of the visitors have been children. This brings us to a vital point ever to keep in mind during any sort of historical commemoration. We must not forget the younger generation. We can never afford to forget the younger generation. You and I are the bridge, the only bridge between the Civil War's legacy and the Americans who will inherit those legacies from us. We must make history appealing and beneficial for the young. Our future depends on it. Back in the Civil War centennial, when I was appointed by President Kennedy as Executive Director of the National Commission, we made a glaring mistake. And I said 50 years ago, after the centennial was over, that if God granted me life to be around at the 150th anniversary, I would make sure that that mistake was not made again. What did we do back in the 60s? We ignored the young people. We were having such a good time marking the 100th anniversary ourselves that we made no investment, no planting of seeds for the young. And hence, the first Sesquicentennial Commission undertaking of any major status came from that vow I made with myself. I asked the Commission to let me produce a 180-minute documentary And we filmed it, and it cost a lot of money. We filmed it, and it runs 3 hours, but that's kind of a half-truth. Actually, the thing is composed of 9 20-minute segments. And I see exactly who the school teachers are here. I see you smiling because you know what I'm leading up to. We broke the Civil War down into 9 factors: the causes, slavery, the battles, leaders, the home front, women, the legacies, things such as that. And teachers can take this film and show a 20-minute segment. And you know, the best 50-minute classroom you can have, whether you're teaching the 4th grade or whether you're teaching sophomores, and there's sort of redundancy there in college. You know. But the best class you can do is to show 20, talk for 20, and wrap it up in 10. That's an ideal class status, and that's what we did. And we employed high-definition photography, aerial filming, reenactors, headshot interviews with scholars speaking on site, and period music. And the 2-disc DVD designed specifically for the classroom came out. The first 3,000 copies went free of charge into every school in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's next to the best contribution I've ever made to my native state. And that film is shown in every school, elementary, middle, high school, and college in the Commonwealth. It's shown as long as they can keep it. The problem with it, the people keep stealing it. We don't know whether teachers or students or burglars come in the dark of night or what. But we're always having to replace the film in various high schools. Now, and you can also purchase the film very nominal price from the Commission. In collaboration with the Library of Virginia, the Commission created what we call the Legacy Project. It's close to my heart. Some of you perhaps were part of it. We sent a photographic team around, and they were publicized through the newspapers and local television that this photographic team would be at, say, this hall this coming Saturday from 9 to 5, or it would be at the Fredericksburg Public Library from 9 to 5, or in a shopping mall parking lot. And all we asked were for people who have Civil War writings, letters and diaries, photographs and whatnot, to bring them in, not to donate them. They may be have no value whatsoever until we ask for them, and then they become treasured, mementos. We didn't want you to give them away. We just simply want to take a picture of them to preserve for scholars coming down the line. And we went to 119 different locales and photographed letters and diaries and mementos. And once they are through scanning them and cataloging them and indexing them, this treasure chest of primary will be available to the public. To date, 32,130 pages of primary material is sitting there. I wish to God I were 40 years younger and could get my teeth into that. That unpublished raw primary material, it's going to be a great collection when it's published. Nothing like this has ever occurred. Nothing occurred akin to this in the Civil War centennial, but it occurred here in our state. Progress builds upon memory, and memory nurtures inspirations, and inspiration is the most comfortable highway to the future. Nothing is more motivational to Civil War history than a battlefield. Oh, you can read volumes about an engagement. You can study dozens of paintings and photographs of the site. You can read all the soldiers wrote about it. But nothing will stir the soul more than to stand on that concentrated ground and just listen. And you will hear the message that those men have to send. There you will sense the emotions and the suffering and the devotion of young men who love their country more than they loved life itself. You want to see a Civil War site in Mississippi? Go to Vicksburg. You want to see a Civil War site in Virginia? Cross the state line. We have them everywhere. And thus we, on the Commission, got heavily involved in a project called Save the Battlefields through the Sesquicentennial years. Your Commission endorsed the creation of a state matching grant program of battlefield preservation projects. Virginia has awarded more than $11 million in matching grants, and this has helped preserve during these few sesquicentennial years, 6,100 more acres of endangered battle land. And working closely with such agencies as Civil War Trust and the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Association, we have increased protected property by acres at such famous sites as Appomattox, Brandy Station, Cedar Creek, Chancellorsville, Gaines's Mill, Malvern Hill, Manassas, Petersburg, Port Republic, and the Wilderness. But the fight is not over. The profit makers are always out there. They're not going away voluntarily. They're blind to anything that's not green and says U.S. Treasury on it. Working with city councils and county boards of supervisors, making your presence known at public gatherings and in letters to editors, you can help preserve that precious ingredient we call battlefields. It's part of our national heritage. And let me give you a dramatic scenario. Today, just west of Fredericksburg, standing alone amid strip malls and bargain stores, is a monument. It's a Civil War monument to the 23rd New Jersey Infantry. It stands on a single acre of ground, all that remains of the bloody 1863 Battle of Salem Church, which was an adjunct engagement associated with Chancellorsville. On the bronze plaque in front of that statue, and it's a normal Civil War statue, marble obelisk and the soldiers standing at the top. On the front side of the memorial is on the plaque the expected phrase, "To the memory of our heroic comrades who gave their lives for their country's union on the battlefield." But walk around that monument, and on another side there's a bronze plaque, and on it, in same types, are the words, "To the brave Alabama boys, our opponents on the field of battle, whose memory we honor." Think about it. England constructed no memorial to French valor after the Battle of Waterloo. The Germans have never dedicated a monument to Polish suffering at Warsaw. Yet American enemies honored each other. Cannot, should not we show the same respect to both sides now? I often wonder if the men who died on those sacred grounds could return to life for a moment. If they could see the fields and woodlands where they forged a nation with their blood being bulldozed complacently. If those soldiers then turned to you for an explanation, what in the name of decency could you say to them? So keep up the fight for preservation. One of the worst illnesses that befalls mankind is called short-sightedness, and it applies very much to history. Your state Sesquicentennial Commission has one more program on tap for you. Nothing affects the soul like music, and the Civil War sparked no fewer than 2,000 new songs. There is nothing in the history of music to compare to what the Civil War did. And the event that has made the greatest single impact on music is the war we fought against each other. Hence, we will solemnize the end of the 150th anniversary next month on Memorial Day, Monday, May 25. At 6:30 p.m., a Civil War concert will be held on the south portico of the State Capitol building in Richmond. The Run Oak Symphony and a 30-voice choir will present through music the deep emotions that coursed throughout the war, from excitement and patriotism to loneliness and inspiration. The concert is open to the public without charge. We hope you will come. It's your concert, and it begins at 6:30, and we hope that as we sing the last song, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, as we sing the last song, the sun will be setting, and the scenario will be perfect to end the Sesquicentennial. But we're going, certainly for an hour and a half, we're going to send music echoing through the streets of downtown Richmond. It's something you don't want to miss. I hope each of you will join us. And a special feature of that concert will be the official debut the public debut for the first time of the Commonwealth's new state song, Our Great Virginia. I gave birth on March the 26th to that song. No, Betty did not get pregnant. If she does, I'm going to look to the east for that star again. I'm the father of Our Great Virginia. I worked 6 years to get it in shape, to put it together, and to get it passed through the Virginia state government. That was my first entry into politics. That is my last entry into politics. I was never prepared for what happened. We had gone 18 years without a state song. I thought I had found a solution. I came forward with it, and 100 wannabes like termites came out of the woods. Not a single newspaper in the state supported it. And it passed the House of Delegates 82-15. It passed the Virginia Senate 37-1. And Governor McAuliffe happily signed it into law on March the 26th. And for me, Our Great Virginia, which you can see on YouTube, just pull up YouTube, Our Great Virginia, and you can get a very good recording of it. It will always be the greatest gift ever made to the state I love so dearly. In looking back at the last 9 years and recalling events of 50 years ago, I can say with certainty that Virginia's sesquicentennial contributions far exceeded the state's efforts in the 1960s. The Centennial had its major museum in Richmond. Its programs were focused on transient, specific events. With all respects to its officers, many of whom remained warm friends to the death, the Virginia Centennial Commission gave minimum thought to long-range projects and educational undertakings that would benefit generations yet to come. Your Sesquicentennial Commission has initiated programs and achieved high success in widely ranging ways. The 3-hour documentary for schools, the academic explorations of our annual signature conferences shed new light on all aspects of the war and remain available. Local committees awakened the past, making participation and pride all the better for their efforts. The History Mobile has carried the war, especially its emotions, into every nook and cranny of the state. We have gained access to over 700 manuscript collections, enough to keep at least 2 generations of historians busy. Additions to battlefield preservation speak for themselves. Tourism has gone up, so did pride in being a Virginian, and the adoption of an official state anthem is icing on the cake. Our history is a living presence. It cannot be commemorated once and then set aside for another decade or half century. History is always with us, whether we acknowledge it or not. Honor it. Learn from it. Make your country better because of it. History is the best teacher you will ever have. Those men and women who suffered and died in the Civil War deserve your constant remembrance as well as your everlasting respect. Look around you. Please, look around you for a moment. What do you see? You see strangers. You see friends. You see kinsmen. What you all see are fellow Americans. They are your fellow Americans, your countrymen who became so by a coupling that occurred in Appomattox on a spring Sunday in 1865. So let us take this time not only to remember with reverence, but to reaffirm our common dedication with these familiar lines. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crowned thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Now, I wondered if you could comment on the role of reenactors, of whom we have so many in the state, as far as historiography goes.
I'm much more concerned with what living history people do. I'm not I'm not a strong supporter of reenactments. In fact, I guess among reenactors, I'm Judas Iscariot. Because the first time we met with President Kennedy in January 1961 in the Oval Office, the Centennial had gotten off to a terrible start. It was like a carnival atmosphere, and they'd had a reenactment at Manassas that had been an absolute disaster. And the President and Dr. Allen Nevins, the new chairman of the commission, and myself were just sitting on the white sofa, and he was in the rocking chair. And I was only 30 years old at the time. I was meeting the President of the United States, and today I probably couldn't think of anything to say. Back then, I was just full of him and vinegar, you know. And he wanted to know how we were going to save the Centennial. And I must say, Jack Kennedy dwells in the twilight of Camelot for you all. He was not that way at all. He's a Boston Irishman, cussed like a sailor, and had a short fuse, to say the very least. And he was threatening just to declare the Centennial non-existent, null and void, with the way it was heading. And I remember distinctly saying something to the fact, Mr. President, one good start would be to stop reenactments on national battlefields. You wouldn't think of staging a reenactment in a cemetery, but a battlefield is just as sacred with the shedding of blood as a cemetery. And he said, you're right, with an expletive in front and back. And he immediately summoned Mrs. Lincoln, his secretary, and issued a presidential directive that no reenactment could ever be held on federal-owned property. And this is why you don't see reenactments there. As a historian, I see their educational value, but I think that's the short end of the string. I think they tend to glorify war. As I've told some of them when we collide on this issue, all right, you want to go out on the field, and children of all ages, and shoot guns and run up and down and play dead. Show me a mother who's just gotten word that her son isn't coming home. Make me understand the pain in her heart. You want to have a reenactment? Show me a boy who's just suffered a shell has blown both legs off of him. He's looking down at his life spurting out the severed arteries. Make me understand how he feels, what he's thinking. Get to the emotional thing of it. Forget the enjoyable side. Then I'll support that. But Appomattox is going to be full of reenactments, and my absence will be very noticeable from them. But they will, where the living history people are demonstrating things, and there are some great living history people out there who demonstrate surgical practices of the Civil War, religious practicing, nursing techniques, etc. That I support. But the reenactment, no, I'm sorry. I just can't do that.
Thank you.
I couldn't be there, but according to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, I used to live in Richmond, there was a quite impressive celebration of I guess the marching of the Union troops into Richmond in the last weekend or so, and they had scholars throughout the city and all sorts of events talking about that period on site. And I was wondering, were you involved with any of the planning of that?
No, I was not involved with the Richmond thing. No, they did that all their own, especially with the National Park Service group in Richmond. And they have some just simply outstanding historians. I have the deepest, most outspoken respect for the National Park Service. They fight for life every day of their lives, because when the government has to cut, the NPS will be the first place they'll go to cut them. So the National Park Service conducted those. It's just hard for you to imagine what happened to Richmond beginning on April 2nd, 1865. I've edited 2 diaries, one of which is the largest diary in American history, and it's being republished this fall with 2,700 footnotes. So I've been working over a period of years on that diary. The citizens weren't prepared for it. And the whole thing breaks down to a simple story. The Confederates were evacuating Richmond, and orders went out to set fire to the warehouses where supplies which the Union Army might use, like bales of cotton or caskets of tobacco, etc., could be had. And they set fire to them, and the wind picked up, blew the fires out of control. And try to imagine this, 54 blocks of downtown Richmond were destroyed. Start about 4th Street and go down the Canal, and then go all the way across to the bottom of Church Hill. It was all just reduced to ashes. And so it was in the middle of all of that that the Union Army came into Richmond. And actually, the flames were so much out of control that Union authorities ordered the 23rd Army Corps to help put out the fire. And the irony of that is the 23rd Army Corps was almost entirely black. The first time Richmonders had ever seen a black soldier is when they came in to save the city. It's just very, very ironic it happened that way. And so this they have commemorated. Lincoln's short visit was there, and when you talk about the short time Lincoln spent there and what he did or did not do, you have a hard time sifting the fact from the fiction, because Spielberg, I think, overdid it in the movie. But Mr. Lincoln was there. You have paintings of Lincoln appearing like a 19th century Moses leading the children to the promised land, which didn't happen at all. He was there and left. But Richmond has a lot to commemorate. It was the capital of Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and the capital of Henrico County all at one time during the war. It was the only industrial city the South had. And so those who argue over the capital being shifted from Montgomery to Richmond are really arguing a moot point, because Richmond had to be preserved at all costs. Montgomery was expendable, but not Richmond. It had to be saved. So I'm delighted that the people of Richmond got a new education of it. And Richmond can truly say that it is a city that grew out of the ashes, because it was just burned to the ground.
You made a comment at the very beginning of your remarks about the failure of people to recognize the history of the nation, and you seemed quite depressed by that. But you made it in the context of the Civil War. Do you think that's a general point, that contemporary culture is just ignoring American history across the board, or is it very specific to the Civil War in your judgment?
You're going to have to run me back again.
Your comment at the very beginning of your remarks was about the failure of our current culture to acknowledge our history and to learn from it. Do you see that? Well, maybe I'll put it this way. Why do you think that's happening? And is it specific to the Civil War, or do you see it across the board in all aspects of history?
It's not that I've devoted my life to the war because of the fact but that the war forced me to devote my life to it through my beliefs in history. You know, the country you know, the America that is yours, begins in 1865, not 1787. It began in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. And if you're just a fundamental Civil War buff and you turn around and look back, no matter where you look, there's this enormous mountain standing there in all of its glory and majesty and perhaps destruction. And that mountain is the Civil War. You can't escape it. And we could go on all night talking about the fact that it's from that war that black people gained freedom and a promise of equality. And you have to add that codicil to it to understand why there is still differences of opinion now. Freedom and equality are not the same. Now, Lee and Lincoln, for example, believed, as did 90% of American whites in 1860, that blacks were simply an inferior race, biologically so, and that they needed to be helped along. Great men like Frederick Douglass, great women like Harriet Tubman were exceptions to the rule. The Lord occasionally put a genius in the middle of all that inferior class. So, while as Lincoln unlocked the door to freedom, the quest for equality would take 100 years. And we haven't reached the goal yet completely. I think we'll all agree on that point. But the war lives on in so much you do. And I give a talk on this. Did I speak on this last year, how the Civil War still lives to you all? Obviously I didn't. But just about everything you have and do is associated with the Civil War. I'll give you a blanket reason. There was the Union Quartermaster General was an absolutely humorless man named Montgomery Meigs. I mean, if he ever smiled, nobody ever bore witness to it. But he was a Union Quartermaster General. And when the call went out that we're going to war, these thousands of troops arrived in Washington to go on duty. And Meigs looked at them and said, "My God, they look like a universal carnival of clowns because they were wearing the uniform. Whether you were 5 feet 2 or 6 feet 4, whether you weighed 100 pounds or 300 pounds, you were given the uniform. Sometimes the sleeves were up to your elbows, sometimes your hands were hidden. A Rhode Island private who stood 4 feet 1 claimed that he didn't wear the uppers to his DVDs, he just pulled the lowers up, cut in eye slits, and tied the top around his head. Meigs looked out at this group and said, for God's sakes, we've got to make them look at least like soldiers. And he immediately contacted the uniform makers in the North and said, henceforth, you're not going to make the uniform. You're going to make a uniform. You're going to make 4 of them, and you're going to call them small, medium, large, and extra large. Pre-sized clothing came out of the Civil War. Every single one of you is wearing something that was made before you bought it. Every one of you. In fact, I won't go so far as to say everything you have owned was pre-sized because I can't swear to that. But pre-sized clothing comes out of the war. So does Santa Claus. So does Christmas time with Thomas Nast, giving us the most beloved figure we have in our annals. Santa Claus came from the artist who became the father of editorial page cartoons. And it goes on down where women wanted to help in the war effort. So many of them went to factories and volunteered to serve as machinists. And those hoop skirts didn't fare too well around machineries. When it was rotating, there were some disasters that took place. And finally, the women got wise, and they asked their sweethearts, their husbands, their fathers, to loan them their trousers. And they wore those to work. And ladies, that's the origin of the slacks. 99% of you ladies are wearing this evening. If there's an exception to the rule, I missed it somehow when you came in. But slacks came out this way. Standard time, home delivery of mail, national cemeteries. And you just go on and on and on. The war affects you. You can't escape it. There is no way you can escape it except to move away from this land. 3 constitutional amendments passed in rapid fashion. Thomas Jefferson went to the grave hopeful that we would be a wonderful nation of farmers. That disappeared with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, so much associated with the North. And we just didn't crawl into it. We came in like gangbusters. So being nothing in 1865, we were by 1900 the most powerful industrial nation on earth. Americans did it, and they were spurred by the Civil War and its demands. So you can't escape it. You just have to live with it and accept it. The mistake that's being made by so many historians and people of the opposite end who don't know history is that they pick and choose what they want to use. And they'll try to pick something out of the past and adjust it to the present. They call it political correctness. It's dead wrong. You may not like history, you may love it, but you can't change it. You have to live with its beauty spots and its warts, and you learn from the mistakes, and you learn from the successes. And there's nowhere else to go to learn mistakes and to learn from successes than history. So we need to take it as it is. I'm a nice, gentle guy. My wife will tell you that. But I get wild sometimes when I hear somebody say, well, now, at Gettysburg, if General Lee hadn't done this, or so if General Lee hadn't done that, we would have won the war. Let me tell you something. If General Lee had 150 years to think about it, I guarantee you he would have done some things differently at Gettysburg. You can't look at the past through the lenses of the present. You look through the blinders those men had. Was secession legal? They thought so. They had every reason to think so. 3 states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, attached codicils to their ratification of the Constitution. And all 3 attached the same codicil there. If, down the way, we don't like it, we don't like this fraternity you're calling the United States, we're free to leave it. They were given permission. So the legality of secession was unchallengeable, at least to Southerners, in 1861. Today, of course, we say, of course, you can't do it. Well, they did think so, and they had a lot going for them to think otherwise. And again, some of you, I could tell by the chuckle, some of you caught the backhanded reference to West Virginia. The Constitution is very, very specific that you cannot take land away from a state without that state's permission. It says that in precise language. The federal government overlooked it, and West Virginia came in. Your grandchildren got something else to think about and worry about. There are 4 counties along the border of Virginia, West Virginia. There are 4 West Virginia counties, and I'm not going to name them, who suddenly have realized they want to come home. All right, think about that. Now I said, your grandchildren go, we won't live to see this thing be educated and go through the appellate process for a couple of generations. But eventually, the Supreme Court has got to take up the issue. And the issue is kind of shaky. The issue starts with, 1, did they have the right to go out? And if the judges do, as Supreme Court judges swear to God they will and obey the Constitution, we're going to get West Virginia back. And that's kind of bad for a Virginia Tech person to see. We have a natural enmity in West Virginia. We swap punches all the time. You know, we say at West Virginia, this 7-course meal in West Virginia is a 6-pack in roadkill. And they come back at us with something other like that. But they're just issues to the Civil War that keep it just fascinating. One other thing to keep in mind, they were small people. These uniforms you see in the museums are not demagnified or made smaller. They were small people. The average male then was 5'7", and he weighed 135 pounds. And I just described General U.S. Grant, 5'7", 135 pounds. Of course, they didn't have McDonald's and Pizza Hut and all those other fast food places. They got fat quickly. But in the thousands of Civil War photographs I've looked at of soldiers, I've never seen a fat one. So they were cut down to size very, very easily.
At what age or educational level did you get interested in the Civil War? College, high school, afterwards? When in your life did you get...
Where did I get interested?
Right.
Oh, goodness. This will tell you how short time is. My grandmother, bless her sainted heart, lived to be 94. And I can remember distinctly as a little boy sitting in her lap, listening to her tell me of her father at the Battle of Gettysburg. You know, it jumps the ages. And of course, Danville, at the other end of 360, was a very, very vital town to the Confederacy. It was the western terminus of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, the last railroad to fall for the defense of Richmond. It was a hospital center, supply depot, and for the last year of the war, an infamous prison camp. 5 or 6 warehouses were converted into prisons. So the city is full of Civil War history. It's a tragedy it doesn't recognize it. It's just a tragedy what Danville's let its history just go down the Dan River. So I was raised in it. My father was a Civil War buff. And I still planned to go into medicine. And I went to Randolph-Macon College, and I had, on the placement exam, I had rated very, very highly in chemistry. So they put me in a junior level chemistry course my freshman year. And the professor came in and said, "Good morning, I'm Professor Miller." That is the last thing I understood himself. So that took care of my medical aspirations. But I still pursued it. I give a lot of talks on Civil War medicine. It's a specialty of mine, and I speak to medical conventions quite often and enjoy doing so. I tell you, you think you argue. You let a bunch of physicians get into a medical argument. It is something to behold when they do.
My mother's father fought in the war, and she never allowed my sister or brother or myself to ever say Civil War. It was the war between the states, not the Northern aggression. No, the war between the states. And that is correct as far as I'm concerned. How did Civil War take hold?
It took hold because by 19th century definition, it was a civil war. The definition of civil war in 1850 were 2 people of a country fighting one another. That was the 19th century. Today, a civil war definition is 2 people in a country fighting for control of the government. It's entirely different. So a civil war is fought to gain control. The South never wanted control of the Union. It wanted to be left alone in independence. The war between the states was a title that the United Daughters of the Confederacy organization came up with. There's nothing wrong with it except it's misleading unless you know where the states are. You're not sure if Virginia was fighting North Carolina, which it does constantly, and vice versa. And of course, North Carolinians like to say they are a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit, Virginia and South Carolina, of course, that kind of thing. But my goodness, in my lifetime, I've heard, I guess, 30 titles involved: the Second American Revolution, the War of Northern Aggression. You go down to Georgia, it's It. And over in Mississippi, it's Damn It. And it just goes by various locations, which leads to an answer that I'll give before you ask the question. Yes, the war ended correctly. Yes, the South should have been defeated, because looking 100 years ahead, had the South won, we would be a country of Balkan states. Try to imagine California having anything in common with Massachusetts, or Minnesota finding a common ground with Mississippi. It is that war that makes us united. It makes it all meaningful. And that's what I'm going to be harping upon at least twice in the 4 talks I'm going to give at Appomattox. Is from that war comes unity. We called ourselves the United States. We were not. We wouldn't have fought a war had we been united. It's that war that unifies us. It's that war that brings us together. It's that war now that's so integral a part of us that we look at a gravestone of a Confederate killed at Gettysburg, or the gravestone of a Union soldier killed at Cold Harbor. We should grieve for them both. They were Americans, and the country lost when both of them died. And you have to have that attitude to understand it. They gave us this country. For good or ill, they gave it to us. And we have to accept it. We should do so reverently, always with thanksgiving. Just think about it. Those men loved their country more than they loved life itself. And they willingly died for us. And if we don't remember that, God help us all for what lies ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.